Okay, my guest is Jay Dyer. Jay, I don't even know where to start, Jay. You've got so many areas of incredible insight and skill as a philosophy major, philosophy writer, the host of a program that looks at politics, philosophy, culture, religion, faith, economy, all of it. The breadth and the width of your knowledge is extraordinary, and the videos you have up are really worth seeing. I'm only beginning to watch them, and they're very, very deep. You've got a well-developed intellect. How did you get to where you are? I mean, it's really amazing the breadth of your knowledge and the willingness that you go to dig up the truth.
Well, thank you. That's very kind words. I grew up in a household that loved the arts. My mom was a big fan of the arts, so I went to a arts-related elementary school. Actually, it was a weird kind of experimental thing in California. My dad was in the military. He was a Navy guy, so I was always interested in the arts. And then when I got to high school and college, I wanted to go into film. I wanted to go into movies. That was my main interest. I started noticing, though, that like Hollywood and film and all that stuff, the way it worked, it wasn't really based around everybody being talented per se. Not to say whether I had talent, just objectively speaking, it didn't seem to be based on that. It seemed to be based on all these other things. And I started noticing, I used to do stand-up, and I would go and I would do amateur night and all this stuff. And I just started thinking about, well, what do I really want? What does all this mean? I started asking big life questions. Then I went to local university, studied philosophy to answer some of those life questions. And then started reading the Bible a lot, started reading the history of Christianity, all the different religions. Like you said, I tried to get really broad just because I found everything kind of at a big scale interconnected. So the way what I do now coalesced was just more or less because when I was doing my grad work, I was looking at psychological warfare and fiction. And I was also taking a couple film classes and philosophy classes, and I was blogging at the same time. And I just started realizing that, well, actually, all of these worlds coalesce. There's always been a deep connection between intelligence agencies and acting, even back to like the Elizabethan period, probably back into the ancient world as well. But, in Shakespeare's time, there was a connection between the court and the theater. And then I started looking at the history of intelligence stuff and how that always tied in with actors and acting. And that led to the blog in its present form. Well, 10 years ago, that's what I was blogging on. And then that just kind of led to, somebody reaching out and saying, hey, do you have a book? And I said, yeah, sure. I didn't, but I just had a bunch of essays and I said, yeah, I'll stick all these in a book. So then that led to, we did a full production TV show on the basis of the first book for Gaia TV, which that's what I'm most proud of because that's always what I wanted to do. And then, I try to talk about everything. So there you go.
And you make a connection between, as you say, the intelligence community and the development of the intelligence state, which started really in earnest shortly after World War II.
Right.
And its intersection with media, with culture, and with its manipulation of same. We could look at, the way the Soviets started this with Willy Munzenberg and his movie reviews, and then on to after the war, you had the development of the intelligence state in 1948 with the declaration of the creation of the CIA, the DIA, the National Security Council. Michael Glennon, who's a professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and who's kind of an establishment figure. We worked as a chief counsel for the U.S. Senate. He just wrote a book about this called The Double Government, and I had him on, and it's amazing. I mean, the parallels that he draws in that he says that this so-called, surveillance state, this intelligence state, what President Trump calls the deep state, accurately, has morphed into this international network that connects with other intelligence groups like the Tavistock Institute and the Mossad and Interpol, and that it has its tentacles into just about every aspect of American life now. It has money that is unbelievable in terms of off the budget financing and business fronts, and that it's become so pervasive that we can't even imagine its influence. It's unprecedented. So you've done a lot of work in terms of understanding what they have in mind, what their agenda is, what their philosophy is, if you will, what they believe in, because after all, it's important we know that since they've got such influence. So can you talk a little on that? I mean, where are these people coming from, and what is their agenda?
Well, what I did was the more that I read about 20th century. So one of my undergraduate degrees is history, and so I was forced to read all these history things and and if you do college, you have to read a lot of stuff you don't want to read, you don't care about. But in a way, that's kind of a blessing in disguise because you get exposed to things that you wouldn't have otherwise. And so I did a lot of reading on the history of the French Revolution. I had a really in-depth class on that, and I hated it at the time because he made us read like 1,500 pages worth of French Revolutionary text. I was just like, this is so awful. But now looking back, I understand how important the French Revolution was to getting to where we are in the modern world. So you could, I think, if you wanted to look at the modern predecessors, you could trace revolutionary thought back to that, or maybe even earlier to Bacon. And so they have a kind of a technocratic ideology. So if you think about Robespierre or Danton or these different revolutionary figures, they thought that you could construct a society purely on the basis of mathematics, logic, and pure reason. And they got that idea from Plato, because Plato sort of sets this out in the Republic. He thinks that the philosopher king can go sit on a mountain and study geometry and mathematics for 20, 30 years or whatever. And then he can come down from the mountain and force everybody into his algorithm, quite literally, like you have to impose the math on the world. So that's the governing basic idea, I believe, is technocracy. And then you have different groups after that sort of try to do revolutionary movements, and they have some successes here and there. But eventually what happens is that they achieve dominance, I believe, in what is referred to as the military-industrial complex. This is the locus of the deep state. And I think it does form it's essentially a conglomeration of the top corporate elite, the Fortune 100, the top banking elite, the top media elite, right? All of these, if you notice the groups that go to the same meetings are all part of the same corporations, like the people that go to the Trilateral Commission or they're in the CFR, they're in the
Bilderbergers. Yep, all of them. And I think that it was Whittaker Chambers who, in his book Witness, who referred to it as a conspiracy of gentlemen. It's not necessarily a conspiracy where people are sitting around a smoke-filled room. It's more that you have people who think the same way and who react the same way, and they don't need to literally conspire. They all have the same belief system. And Chambers also talked, in his book is amazing, the book Witness, that he was a communist who operated inside the FDR administration, and of course he broke the whole story of communist infiltration open with the Hiss case when he accused Alger Hiss of having been a Soviet operative. And he talks about the communism as the world's second oldest religion, whereas the first religion is God and the creation of the universe. And that he says that it was born when the serpent convinced Eve to partake of the fruit of knowledge, the forbidden fruit. In other words, when she was promised that she could know all things, know good and evil, that if she only partook of the fruit, in other words, she could overthrow God in heaven and be God on earth. And then, of course, when she brought Adam into it, it became a conspiracy, and that they then were banished from the garden. But ever since then, in every generation, you have this movement or these group of people who feel that they can overthrow God and that they want to create some kind of a utopia on earth, that they call themselves enlightened, or there's different names for it, illuminated, and that they really believe, and many of them sincerely, and that they should control the world, that they could lord over the rest of us who are not enlightened, and create this earthly return to the Garden of Eden. And I think that that's what people like yourself and others who are genuine in the real sense, woke and aware and witting, have, right? I mean, we've countered them in every generation by exposing them, by identifying them, and by keeping them in check. And I think that right now we cannot talk about this because it's happening, and that is the pandemic. This is a real, whether or not it was created in a lab, that's another subject. We have no idea. But either way, it is a real opportunity for them to wield their control, which they've tried to do again in every generation over the world. And it's a very frightening prospect. I mean, the fact that they've gotten entire portions of the world, particularly the Eastern Seaboard liberal establishment and the Western democracies, to agree to lock themselves into their homes in a state of medical, right? I mean, it's a sort of medical martial law. Right. People are afraid to go outside, and they're already putting subtly in place laws that would penalize people if they're not wearing a mask in public and this sort of thing. And they've gotten people to accept this under the guise of the emergency, the guise of the fear that this dread disease, which is a terrible disease, but it's only really, when you put it in proportion, they could have protected people who were most vulnerable rather than make everyone else who's healthy locked down the way they've done it. But they've pulled it off. Everyone is locked down. I'm locked down. You're probably locked down. And I think that it's finally coming to a head now in that it's being exposed that this isn't happening and people are coming out. Georgia stopped locking down 2 weeks ago and nothing has happened. There's been no increase in hospitalizations. People who are vulnerable are being taken care of. And so I think people are waking up and they're going to start going out. But I mean, I'm concerned about the next stage. I mean, I don't know what they're going to try now. What do you think?
Well, it's funny you said that because two things. The first thing is when you mentioned Genesis, I don't think I've ever thought about that, like that Satan was actually proposing radical equality, right? Because he's telling Eve, like, if you partake, you'll be like God. That's why he doesn't want you to have it. So it'll be total equalism, which is impossible. There's no such thing as a total equalitarianism. But and then on the topic of the pandemic, one thing that struck me this week, I got a hold of a book that a friend recommended me from 1981. This is an old futurist work, and it's a whole bunch of idiots and wackos like Tim Leary, Barbara Marx Hubbard, Jonas Salk is in there, Carl Rogers is in there, and then a guy you may recognize named Willis Harman, who co-wrote Changing Images of Man. Now, Harman's so far is the most interesting essay in this collection because in 1981, he wrote about what work would be like in roughly in our time, right? Right. And what he speculates is that he says that situations could come about to where all of society would change on the basis of perhaps health or environmental factors so that we would learn who the essential and non-essential workers are. And then when we learn who the essential workers are, he says, anybody non-essential, if you want to have work or if you want to have even technological devices, and he's speaking of like having a car, he says you have to demonstrate your usefulness to the collective. And if you don't demonstrate your usefulness, you don't get anything like that because you don't need it. It's a needs-based economy, he says, of the future. And here's the kicker. He says it will all be based around a universal basic income. So what I've been saying this whole time, because of a lot of the global elite writings that I'd read I've been reading them through like back to the last century, to Russell and H.G. Wells and these guys, the big technocrats. And that was one of the things that H.G. Wells and Russell said was that this future period, the final revolution, will be one where you'll have the universal basic income. Then I read the Harman essay from 1981. It's amazing that he was saying that this is the economy would essentially be based around austerity. It would be based around tiny living, tiny houses, austerity. This is what the millennials and the Zoomers are into. Like they want to just live in vans and roll around and not
they want to get rid of airplane travel.
Yes.
It's too polluting.
So that's what I think the next phase is to try to bring in the UBI, to try to bring in the austerity, the post-human order, the post-industrial civilization.
I think that's very, very prescient in terms of where their agenda lies. And, I think of Aldous Huxley's book, Brave New World, and he was a truth teller. I mean, he talked about an international medically induced concentration camp. And his brother, Julian Huxley, was the founder of UNESCO, which is the world so-called, school board. And he believed in continuing his grandfather's agenda of eugenics and evolutionary theory. His grandfather was the main promoter of Darwin's book, survival of the fittest, or whatever he
Right.
called it. I mean, Origins of Species, which took off like a rocket around the world when it was published in 1859, and which basically overthrew God. I mean, it said that man is essentially emerged from, as Darwin said, a small warm pond, and somehow after umpteen billions of years of bumping into each other and breeding with superior species, out pops a new species, the human race. And that process continues as more superior species continue to evolve. It's a complete racist idea, of course,
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
utterly unfounded. And yet, Julian Huxley, his grandson, implemented a religious agenda, which I think he called evolutionary humanism, by
Yes.
which they would take over all of the world religions
Yep.
in de facto. They would leave in place the trappings. They'd leave the
Yep.
the stained glass and the ritual and the services, but they would take over the philosophy. They would take over the belief in a creator of the universe and a divine lawgiver. They would replace that with this idea that we all are just species. We're like animals, and that we have to be improved by those who are in a position to know better. And it's a very communistic idea, of course. And his ideas, I think, as a founder of the UN and as a, as a beginner of this whole establishment idea, that's what's been implemented piece by piece, and that's what we're looking at now.
Yeah, one of the books that I covered, I think about 6 months ago, was Julian's philosophy of UNESCO, and it sounds like it's going to be some boring thing about bureaucrat type stuff, but actually, when you read the essay, it's about 40 or 50 pages. He just lays out everything that you said. He says, we are going to create a fake world religion. We're going to create a superior race, but not like based on Teutonic Knights or based on whites. Or he says, we're going to select, different people from the elite from basically all the races. And so it's more of like a Fabian socialist model. It still has all the trappings of evolution. You're absolutely right there. But they want more of a collective, almost like it's like everybody is part of a giant science experiment. There's a great book by Rebecca Lemov called The World as a Laboratory. And she's talking about this technocratic mindset of everybody being viewed as a science experiment. So basically everything is run by Bill Nye and Neil deGrasse Tyson, who, I mean, they're kind of fake scientists in my view, but the real quote scientists are the mad scientists. That's who's the brains behind this operation, and then all those sort of CFR Bilderberg. They're more like the bureaucrat enforcers of this whole thing. But yeah, the ideology is absolutely that, to create this kind of civic religion. Actually, that goes back to Auguste Comte, the father of sociology. He was in that French Revolutionary tradition, so he had that same kind of notion of Robespierre and all those guys of overthrowing. But rather than overthrowing, he said, we've got to give the people a noble lie, like Plato talked about. We've got to have some kind of religion. And what most of these global elite that I've read, they all say across the board, well, just give them something kind of new agey that is just a cloak for science.
Right. And that's that. The New Age is very much a part of the UN. They actually have a New Age meditation room in there. And it's again, I mean, it's kind of replacing what our conventional Christian, Jewish, even Muslim mainstream religions with this new idea. I think it's kind of a combination of Eastern mysticism and
Yes.
And other sort of earth-based principles. And I do see it going back to, I think Darwin was probably one of the big Pied Pipers of this movement, and along with Marx, of course, and as you say, the French Revolution. When you studied the French Revolution, did you read James H. Billington's book, Fire in the Minds of Men?
Fire in the Minds of Men, yeah. The revolutionary faith is key to this because it's ultimately, I mean, I think you're absolutely right to go back to the Garden of Eden or something like that, because, I mean, Saul Alinsky dedicates the book to Satan, right? Rules for Radicals. And so the whole idea is satanic. There's a great book by an Orthodox philosopher too, Father Seraphim Rose. He has a book on nihilism. And all it is that he traces the development of revolutionary thought. And in his view, nihilism is sort of the ultimate apex of revolutionary thought, because once you get to that point, you get to the point where it's almost like destruction for destruction's sake, and that there's some sort of supreme sort of inversion, satanic power in destruction for destruction's sake. And so he points to certain figures who have embodied that kind of a mindset, like Nietzsche and people like that. But yeah, you're absolutely right, because I view Darwin as the mythos of the British Empire. So just in the same way that somebody like Virgil was tasked with writing the myth of the Roman Empire in the Aeneid, and sort of that promulgates the state mythology, I view Darwin as the state mythologizer for the British Empire, to put out the view that the Anglican, Protestant, whatever, is sort of the apex of all of civilization. Everyone else is less culturally refined, and then they have to sort of be put under this yoke, right, of the British Empire and all that. And then the British Empire, is it Lord, I think it's Lord Curzon. I've read a bunch of these lords. They all kind of get mixed up in my head. But I think Lord Curzon, one of the guys that wrote the Commonwealth of God. And the Commonwealth of God was actually really influential in the CFR trilateral circles as to how to view the Pax Americana. So the Pax Americana really kind of inherits the Pax Britannia, right? Mm-hmm. And so they adopt this ideology, and that's how I got into Quigley. And again, you're absolutely right. I've done, I think, 42 or somewhere in there of the global elite books. And across the board, everybody has to believe Darwin. That's across the board. Marx, it's a little, yeah, there's a lot of Marxists in there. Some people are diehard capitalist libertarians. But then you start to realize that some of these people, like David Rockefeller, they even transcend that dialectic, and they actually at times favor communism. David Rockefeller,
and they financed communism.
Exactly right. So you start to realize that even the so-called capitalists at time see socialism and Marxism as a very useful tool.
Yeah, not to mention Nazism as well.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned Carroll Quigley. He was Bill Clinton's mentor. He was a professor at Georgetown University, the author of Tragedy and Hope, which kind of blows the whistle on this whole Anglo-American establishment that you're talking about. I mean, starting with Cecil Rhodes in South Africa, and I think Curzon was a member of the one of those roundtables, and
he was. Yeah,
they gave birth to not just the Council of Foreign Relations, but the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London, and several of these similar type groups in capitals around the world. And their agenda is to use, in a sense, free market capitalism in the literal sense to dominate the world and to establish an informal world government, leaving in place, of course, the trappings of government, just like they leave in place the trappings of faith, but yet controlling it by means of unelected, appointed, or just people of influence, financially, culturally, who have a worldview and who really implement and control how things are done. Now, I think that the movement to elect Donald Trump, the movement in Great Britain of the Brexit, that's what this was all about. It was a rejection of this trend toward world appointed order, that whereas people in England were waking up and realizing that these unelected bureaucrats in Brussels had control over what their children were learning in school, had control over their diets, had control over where they went. I mean, there was all these intricate rules tying them down, that they had lost control of their own lives and their own destinies, or they were losing it, and that it was undemocratic. And so they took back their country with the Brexit. We elected Donald Trump for the same reason. And I see this pandemic as a way to stop us.
Yeah.
Not that it's been created, I have no idea, but either way, it's being used to keep us locked up and to try to neutralize us. And, I wonder what their end game is on this, because I've heard some very, very scary and frightening things like, forced vaccines. And right. I think it was Bill Gates, who's a big part of this, I would argue, putting a tattoo on people and getting an ID card to prove that you have immunity. And, China's already done it with their social scores. Right. The major, Google and them, and I don't want to say too much about them because we're on there right now, right? So we have to play ball. But, they are developing, in conjunction with several major universities, a scoring for college students, right? I mean, are we that far off from having a computer chip implemented as they talk about in the Book of Revelations? I don't know. I don't think it's inconceivable.
Right. It is possible. One of the guys that I did was Jacques Attali. He's the Kissinger of France. He's a futurist. He was one of the key policymakers for he's sort of a French neocon. And he talked about in 2006 where we would be at right now. And what is scary is that everything he said in his book is pretty much accurate. He said that everybody will be watching live streams. Everybody will be focused on, and he said that the live streams will continually sort of morph into things international. So it'll anything he says international, like FISA. I don't follow soccer, but all that soccer, international soccer crap. He says all those things will be very useful. And he says, because what's going to happen is, he says there will be nomadic devices, by which he means cell phones, which will allow people to lose any connection to their past, to their roots. The nomadic device makes you rootless, and so then you don't have anything to ground you. Then you're much more primed for being downloaded with whatever the latest, sort of PC update or whatever is. So Attali is important because he said that the medical side of things would be key for bringing in this stuff, as did many of these writers. But he said that insurance and medicine will be key for how the technocracy will be put into place. He says by 2030 or 2050. Between 2030 to 2050, he says is the key window for all of the infrastructure and the technocracy to be rolled out. So to me, it looks like that's the kind of game plan that they're rolling out. I mean, he doesn't differ with any of the other guys on the major points. The only thing they tend to differ on is like, how do we get to the end result? Like maybe we do plan A, maybe we do plan B. They're all agreed on the same end goal, which is this technocratic sort of AI run state. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right that this shows the medical side of how the New World Order would be brought in, and a lot of people weren't aware of the medical side of it. There's a woman, Dr. Nancy Banks. She wrote a good book on how the medicine side of things, which all of the the American Medical Association, so that was all set up by the Rockefeller Foundation. That's all their stuff. They set up all that stuff, really, so they had a kind of a monopoly over the medicine in America. And then that's when you come up into the 60s. There's that famous meeting, the Dr. Day tapes, if you're familiar with that, Richard Day, where he talks about, as the head of Planned Parenthood under the Rockefellers, what they would bring in the next several decades through medicine. And this is what most people missed. But a couple of the key global elite books, Fritjof Capra, Jacques Attali, Jonas Salk, they were very clear, because they're writing, these policy books for white paper reading bureaucrat types. Sure. They're going to be reading and they're going to realize, yes, it's medicine will be key to bring this stuff in.
And there's also the beginning and awareness of the so-called transhumanism movement. And I think that the story of Jeffrey Epstein, on the surface, it's a horrendous story of an international prostitution and pedophile ring that has connections in cities all over the world. And yet the even worse story in certain ways is the transhumanism linked to it, and his fact that it's now come out that he maintained an office at Harvard and was there often after his conviction, and he had a lot of connections right here in my own hometown of Boston at both Harvard and MIT, and that they were talking about this transhumanism movement, which is very much a continuation of the eugenics movement of pre-World War II. The idea, and also Ray Kurzweil from the Kurzweil Institute is a major figure in this. The idea is to create a new kind of man, with computer implants that can live to 200, that can have perfect health because you have electronic means to monitor all aspects of your health and keep you alive. That you can have cosmic consciousness because you're drawing upon total computer recall, and then essentially you are a part human, part components, part electronic, and that their belief is that this is going to be eventually a new species, will emerge. It's sort of like it's very much the Nazi idea of the Übermensch, or Nietzsche's idea of the Superman, and that this is not a joke. I mean, this is something that's going on at MIT. There was a guy that was recently fired as head of the media lab. His name escapes me right now, but he had papers up. I think they might still be up if you look it up at the media lab, talking about this. This isn't, I'm not making this up. This is the transhumanism is a major movement in the scientific community, and these are people who are not, they're not in government. I mean, we look to scientists now to run everything.
Yeah, one of the books I did was Annie Jacobson's book, Pentagon's Brain, and that's all a 500-page history of DARPA. It's really good because she goes into the background of this mindset of how they got to where they thought they could do this. And it ties in everything to do with, like you said, Darwinism before, because if everything's evolving, then presumably, we'll just evolve into being computers, right? We'll just get downloaded onto zip drives and then we can be reloaded into new bodies or whatever. Right. Which I think is ludicrous, right? But I mean, that's like believing in a genie, right? Like I'm going to be, downloaded into a zip drive. But people believe any kind of crazy myth, so I guess it's plausible that people will believe this. So part of how they got to that was some of the MK Ultra projects were involved in biometrics. So biometrics would be what they would rename eugenics. Eugenics just gets rebranded as biometrics, and then it morphs out of the purely race-based theory into why don't we just transcend man as a whole, right? So let's just move into the post-human. We don't need man at all because maybe man is the problem. That's the mindset of these people. Hence the idea of the radical, depopulation. We need to kill everybody, get it down to 500 million or even lower. Some of the people think. So I started reading a lot of those guys, and I read Charles Galton Darwin, and I read Malthus, and I read where that idea comes from. And it is, like you said, that's an even older idea that Plato even said, like if you don't have the right number of people on the back of Gaia, like she'll get tipped over or some nonsense like this. He says something like that. So you have to balance out, the numbers of people that you have. And another thing he said too, feed everybody grains. Plato said, be sure and feed the peasants grains, because if they eat meat, they'll be too strong. You can't control them. That's why we're seeing this push for veganism. So one of my good buddies, Tristan, he's a big health guy. He's been studying the history of all this vegan stuff. And I noticed a Toffler back in the 70s. He's one of these global elite. He said we'll promote veganism. We'll tie it to these kind of radical revolutionary movements. That way we can control diet. So you'll notice what another element that's really being pushed in the midst of the CV stuff, COVID stuff, is, it's meat. You ate meat. This is you ate a bat.
It's bad for the environment, right?
It's bad. Yes, you're killing the environment by having. So you need to eat the Beyond Burger, which it just happens that Bill Gates and all the Cargill and all these elite, they have all this money in the fake food that they want everybody to eat. Anyway, so yes, so I think that if we look at it from that perspective, then we know that what's happening is largely rolled out as a plan. And once you see that, it's really transparent. It's like, this is ridiculous. I mean, who would believe this stuff?
No, I mean, and yet who would have believed 2 months ago that we would all be willing to be locked up in our homes? Exactly. I mean, this is, it would have been unthinkable for anyone. I mean, it's just, and now we have scientists like Fauci basically running the country. I mean, this is, they're replacing our elected officials.
This is technocracy on display right here.
Exactly. And I think that one of the whistleblowers of the 19th century was none other than Mary Shelley in her book Frankenstein. She was part of this, what I would loosely call the conspiracy. Her father, Richard Godwin, was one of the major supporters of the French Revolution. Her husband, Percy Shelley, was a big, kind of a so-called progressive operator. And she was surrounded by that, but yet the book kind of tries to blow the whistle on what she knew, that they're trying to create a new kind of a man. I mean, the whole Darwinian idea is that you take non-life and turn it into life, which of course is impossible.
Ludicrous.
And it's crazy. And that, that this new kind of man would then not be would be out of control. And I do see this. I mean, even like, I don't know, the Drudge Report, which I no longer trust. I think it's been taken over by somebody because it's become so establishment. But they did an article the other day showing computerized dogs. And I don't mean dogs literally like living dogs, but computer dogs. And they showed, like a lot of them. I mean, that's terrifying. I mean, they could be programmed to kill, to take over. It's just, the amount of evil that these people can do using artificial intelligence, the computer, the Internet of Things, all of this stuff is something that's a big concern.
Did you see that video that was going around a couple days ago? I think it was Singapore, where there was one of those DARPA dogs that was like barking and policing the people in the park.
I'll have to look at that. That's
So they were rolling one of these out, and I can't remember if it was some Asian country, but so like people were out in the park and they weren't social distancing, and these dogs, these robot dogs come up. It looks like a science fiction movie, and they're like barking orders at people to be 6 feet apart or whatever. So yeah, I mean that's the crazy thing that I realized reading a lot of these high level military things was that a lot of what happens in the military theater, the deep state was just sort of collecting all the information as to what worked best, even all the way back to places like Vietnam, where they would run simulations and experiments in the battlefield in Vietnam and then collect that data and then turn it on the target population. So that was what the deep state was trying to do all the time, was just basically collate all this information to figure out how to best control the domestic target population. And then of course that's rolled out everywhere, because you notice we're starting to see, and I think we started to see it with moral stuff 4 or 5 years ago. I mean, granted, you could argue that technology and products in general were rolled out globally through corporations. But if you look at the social engineering aspects of things, like we started noticing all of a sudden, all the Fortune 100 had a unified plan on how you're supposed to view moral issue X, how you're supposed to view moral issue Y. And this is rolled out everywhere. And then suddenly, we start saying, oh, now everybody has to have the same view of CV across the world. This is a plan now from World Health Organization, and they're going to dictate bark orders at everybody, right? So this is evident that the nascent form of the global government is already there, and it's being sort of rolled out. And I believe that it's in phases. Like there's these different actuaries in phases. Different documents actually discuss that too. The Rockefeller lockstep document, this kind of stuff.
No, I think you make the case. I mean, it seems even to a lot of normies, they might see it that way. And I just want to, we're getting toward the end of the segment, but I want to bring up one other thing, and this is something I want to be very careful about because I don't want to get kicked off of YouTube. It's one of those subjects that you're not supposed to touch, and that is the transsexual movement. Look, if people want to call themselves a male or a female, that's their business. But the idea that you would have to call someone who's a woman a man, or a man a woman, and that they could be this, it seems to me that this is part of this, what we're talking about here from the Garden of Eden, that you can create reality. You can invent whatever you could be, whatever you want to be. I mean, I had a very old person recently tell me that, well, I mean, if you're a woman and you want to be a man, why not? So I said, well, then why not? Why can't you then be young? I mean, we could just be whatever we say we are.
I always tell the people that tell me that, I say, okay, well, I'm going to start identifying as you. Is that okay? I'm going to go do crazy stuff, and then I'm going to say that I'm you, and everybody's like, no, you can't do that. You can't say you're me. Well, why not?
Exactly. I mean, why? And that you're somehow bigoted if you don't agree with this. And look, again, I'm not saying that someone can't call themselves a pumpkin if they want to. I don't really care. But the idea that we have to do this legally and that we can be, serious penalties can be wrought against us if we don't recognize this, I think is part of the latest envelope edge of changing conventional morality. I mean, and even just maybe 4 or 5 years ago, if you heard of someone who was transitioning from a male to a female or vice versa, it would be seen as a tragedy. It would be seen as somebody who has serious psychological problems. Now it's like, oh, they're happy now. This is good. And it's, and it has an edge to it of control. It's not just an opinion.
Yeah, I heard an interesting analysis about that the other day, that could also be part of how you move society in terms of being post-human. So in other words, to get to the transhumanism, you need a phase where people accept the notion that there's no fixity of genus or species or anything like that. So keep in mind, it's intimately connected to philosophy. So if you believe that there are objects in the world that have essences, right? I mean, Plato, Aristotle, this is ancient philosophy. So things have the essence that they have, and they're sort of created that way to have that essence, right? then they're never going to completely morph into something else. I mean, they might have variation within the species, but for example, you'll never have a whale that starts to, in its DNA, code for a bear. Only what's in the whale is the coding for a whale. Now, there might be mutations. The whale might have a third eye or something like that, or have some weird, but that's still only a whale eye. It's not starting to grow hair. It doesn't grow paws. It doesn't have the coding for a different species, even with the variation. So that to me suggests that there is some level of fixity of essences or objects in terms of philosophy, that they can't completely morph into something else, right? And like you said, something can't just come out of nowhere from nothing with no agent or cause to bring that about. So in the same way, I think I look at it from the vantage point of psychological warfare and how to get people to buy into things and perspective. Like if you wanted to get people to accept that cyborgs and all these things are also another valid form of sentient being or whatever, you need like phases where people start to accept that, well, there is no, fixity of essence or species or being. They're just whatever, like you said, you determine it to be, rather than those things are like you're learning what is objectively the case. It's flipped around and it's like, no, you make reality, which is total nonsense. It's crazy.
Right. But that is the core belief actually of Marxism. That everything is perception. There's no such thing as empirical.
It is. Everything's in flux.
Truth.
Yeah, it's pure flux. Exactly.
Everything is in a state of dialectic, which is opposites crashing into each other to create a new dialectic. Exactly. I mean, this is why Marx admired Darwin so much and wanted to dedicate Das Kapital to Darwin and wrote him a letter asking if he could.
Yeah, please. Yeah, he wrote a letter. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so, this is part of this entire view. I mean, Darwin did it in the biological sphere. Marx did it in the political and social sphere, which is the dialectic that would eventually lead to world communism, when we would all become one gigantic ant colony. We would have to give up any semblance of individual identity and property and all the things that make us who we are.
Well, George Bernard Shaw, all of these characters. Russell says that, and then who was that? The Wallace Harmon says that you have to demonstrate that you serve the collective in the future austerity society. And he says, if you don't, then you won't get your social credits. It's like, if you don't demonstrate your usefulness to the collective. Yeah.
And if people think we're kidding about that, take a look at China. They're doing the social credits now. If you don't have a high social credit, you don't get anything in that country. Anyways, Jay Dyer, listen, I really appreciate you joining me. I'd like to do it again sometime, and as a part of an ongoing series. Can you let my listeners and viewers know where they can find out more about you and your books or your website or anything else?
Yeah, my site is jaysanalysis.com. It's just a lot of essays and articles on philosophy, history, theology, geopolitics, film analysis. My two books are basically movie analysis. I call it Roger Ebert 2.0. So it's like a new weird way to do movie analysis, where we look at the conspiracy aspects, we look at the historical aspects, the fact, the fiction, and even at times what intelligence agencies might have been involved in this or that production. So two good books on that. If you get them at my site, it's signed copies there. And then my TV show is at Gaia TV. It's called Hollywood Decoded, one full season of that. And then my YouTube channel is just Jay Dyer. So that's pretty much it.
All right, Jay. By the way, do you talk about Stanley Kubrick in your book?
Yes. In fact, the first book, the first 100 pages is Kubrick. So
excellent. Good.
You get the first one. Yeah. The whole, I do an introductory chapter on Kubrick and film. And then I do, what did I do? I did Eyes Wide Shut, The Shining, and 2001. So that's the first 80 pages or so.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to reading it and having you back.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay.
All right.
Have a good one. Thank you.